Okay, so I want to do three things in the next 10 minutes. I'm not going to dwell too much on the legal framework surrounding proactive disclosure, perhaps give a quick introduction to it. But I want to focus most of my time looking at this idea of measuring proactive disclosure. So what do we know about the extent of proactive disclosure in the Sri Lankan context? And this is, I'll draw on examples from the work that we've been doing at Verité Research, trying to look at kind of what's available in terms of government information, particularly in the online space. And thirdly, I'll talk about how we can draw from what we know about proactive disclosure into kind of brainstorming some recommendations for how we can improve and strengthen its scope. And hopefully we can build on this at Q&A. And when I talk about kind of measuring the openness of government, I like to think about it in two ways. The first way, I think it's useful to think about it, obviously, it's for information's sake. I think more information increases kind of citizens' ability to scrutinize government functions, government departments, but also better access services. But I think there's also an instrumental kind of component to this idea of measuring proactive disclosure or measuring information disclosure. And that's a conversation about how does this idea of measuring or ranking actually promote increasing information disclosure or promote this idea of openness. And so this is kind of a more behavioral change good that emerges out of measurement. So essentially, under Regulation 20 issued under the Right to Information Act, all public authorities are required to routinely disclose particular categories of information. Just breaking it down into thematic clusters, they include institutional information, so the vision, the mission, the organizational structure of the public authority. Then looking at public services, so what are the services that the public authority provides? What are the consultation or public consultation is the public authority due to have? What are the service? What are kind of the kind of beneficiaries of the services that the public authority provides, and so on. Then also fiscal information is something that's captured under the scope of Regulation 20. The public authority is required to proactively disclose information relating to expenditure and the actual disbursements, and as well as budgets. So essentially, when you look at proactive disclosure, it has great wins for both the demand and the supply side of RTI. From the demand perspective, of course, it reduces the cost to the citizen in terms of accessing information. So it reduces the time taken to travel to public authorities, it reduces kind of the back and forth that you might spend in an appeal stage. So the fact that you have a repository of information is really good in terms of reducing the citizen's time taken to engage with the RTI process. It also increases public accountability, obviously, by increasing the transparency or openness of government. And often in Sri Lanka, a lot of public accountability questions are generally focused in the realm of opinions. So I think this particular corrupt practice went on, or I think there is mismanagement happening in this particular authority. I think the scope of using proactive disclosure to its full potential is to shift debate from the realm of the subjective more into kind of looking at objective, pushing it to objective discussions where you increase the use of data or information in kind of citizen engagement with government, and that becomes harder to deflect. And then obviously on the supply side, it significantly reduces the burden on information officers that are processing information requests, as well as increasing kind of inter-institutional information sharing. So what happens, I know particularly in the case of regulatory bodies or even the Ministry of Finance when it comes to budget season, they're often scratching their heads figuring out kind of, where has the money been spent, how have these promises been implemented, and even within kind of agents in the government, there's very little information flow that goes across. So I think increasing proactive disclosure, increasing the scope of proactive disclosure, increases kind of the ability for regulators and oversight ministries to really perform or do their job. So something that Verité has been fairly interested in is how do we use technology, or how do we use the concept of a dynamic platform to really start a conversation around proactive disclosure or information disclosure. We kind of looked at it in this idea of, look, if it's not only the information that is valuable, but it's also people talking about the information that holds some value. And the more people talk about the information, the more likely government departments are to do something about it. So we looked at it in the context of the budget. Now, often conversations around the budget generally focused on budget promises. So what is the government promising this year? What is in the budget speech? There's very little conversation that focuses on budget implementation. So what happened to the money that was allocated? And that conversation doesn't really happen quite frequently. And so this is something that really bothered us. And so we tried to look at, we didn't really focus so much on budget promises. We tried to look at kind of the history of what had happened to the previous budget promises that were given. Where did the money go? We actually were fairly disappointed to note that in 51% of budget promises, we actually had no idea. So we had little to no visibility on what happened to the budget promises or the money that was allocated. This is in June 2017. Since then, the government has actually instituted a budget implementation office. And so I'm actually really pleased to note that when we did the second round of monitoring in December 2017, actually only 11% of the promises, we didn't know what happened to them. Now, this is quite apart from whether they were implemented or not. At least on an openness metric, fiscal information with regard to budget implementation is perhaps significantly more transparent than it was in June 2017. The second example I want to pull out is a study that we did actually in collaboration with the World Bank, where we measured the online proactive disclosure. And using kind of Regulation 20 as a frame, we measured the online proactive disclosure across 53 ministries and the Office of the President and the Prime Minister. What did we find? Unsurprisingly, and this is obviously in the first year of RTI, we weren't expecting kind of stellar numbers here. We were just trying to establish a benchmark. We found that a majority of online proactive disclosure, or the websites of public authorities, had very low levels of proactive disclosure. Note that Regulation 20 requires public authorities to display to display all this information on a continuous basis. So it's not looking at kind of a static repository of information that gets updated once a year. So a majority of these public authorities, of the 55 authorities that we measured, ranked so there was between 11% to 40% of the information that was disclosed. So very low levels of information. That's a story that I could have told you without doing a study. But interestingly, when you drill deeper into kind of what was being disclosed, you had more of these public authorities disclose kind of very procedural information. So their vision, their mission, their organizational chart, that was often fairly frequently uploaded. What they lacked was substantive information. So information about procurement, information about budgets, information about budget expenditure rather, information about kind of the services that we're offering. And just to pull out kind of a number, only 5% of the 55 public authorities that we reviewed online published their tender awards. Only 17% of public authorities published the services that they offered. So this raises kind of questions that I think we should reflect on at the Q&A session. And I just want to kind of briefly talk about how what we know in terms of proactive disclosure and what we've seen in terms of how these websites are updated and uploaded should inform how we think about proactive disclosure infrastructure. So obviously, training information officers on Regulation 20 and exactly the categories of information that are required, that's required to be kind of collated is important. Websites are often extremely static and dynamic and unreliable. So websites were down, information that was up yesterday was down today, and there was no kind of consistent format across these websites. So looking at, okay, how do we engineer websites that have a consistent format that tallies with Regulation 20 might be a good way to start in terms of building the infrastructure to collate all of this government information. And actually, sometimes there was actually valuable information on these sites that correspond to Regulation 20. It's just I had to click through like 50 clicks to find it. And you can't expect citizens that need this information in a hurry to exercise that kind of diligence. And obviously because we have the ability of generating this data, I think the Commission can also use it in terms of their dialogue and discussion with public authorities on proactive disclosure, kind of sending warning letters to authorities that are non-compliant. I'm happy to talk about the study in more depth and happy to talk about kind of how I can think about proactive disclosure infrastructure, but I'm out of time, so I'll save that for Q&A.